That DeLorean from Back to the Future sitting in a museum, that's just a replica. The real hero cars from your favorite movies disappeared decades ago, and some are still missing. Today, we're tracking down 10 famous movie cars that vanished after filming Wrapped, and the wild stories of how collectors finally found them rotting in barns, junkyards, and forgotten warehouses. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nostalgia Rides for more legendary cars. The original Bullitt Mustang. 1968 Ford Mustang GT390. Warner Brothers used two identical Highland Green Mustang GT390s for the legendary chase scene in Bullitt. And after filming Wrapped in 1968, both cars disappeared into the void. One got cut up for parts and scrapped, but the other one vanished completely for nearly 50 years. The hero car that Steve McQueen actually drove ended up in Kentucky, VARN, owned by a family who bought it in 1974 and kept it hidden from the world. The owner knew exactly what he had, but he refused every offer from collectors and museums because his wife loved driving it to the grocery store, like it was a regular car. When the family finally revealed the car at the 2018 Detroit Auto Show, the automotive world lost its mind because everyone assumed this thing was gone forever. The car sold at Mecum Auctions in 2020 for $3.74 million, making it the most valuable Ford Mustang ever sold. The wild part is how original it still was, complete with the dents and scrapes from the actual chase scene because the family never restored it or fixed anything. If you ever wondered where movie cars go when Hollywood's done with them, this is your answer. They end up in random barns owned by people who just wanted a cool driver. Herbie the Love Bug. 1963 Volkswagen Beetle. Disney built 26 Volkswagen Beetles for the original 1968 Herbie movie. And after filming Wrapped, most got crushed or sold off as regular used cars. The primary hero car that did most of the close-up work disappeared for over 30 years, until a Disney historian tracked it down in a California warehouse, buried under boxes and film equipment. The car was in rough shape with faded paint, missing parts, and decades of neglect. But the VIN number matched Disney's production records perfectly. A collector bought it at auction in 2015 for $86,250 and spent another $50,000, restoring it to screen-accurate condition. Which seems crazy until you realize how much people love that little racing Beetle. The interesting part is how many fake Herbies are running around out there because every white Beetle with racing stripes gets called the real Herbie at car shows across America. Disney kept terrible records of their movie cars because they never expected anyone would care about them 50 years later, which is why tracking down authentic hero cars has become such a detective game. This particular car now lives in a private collection and shows up at Disney events, where grown adults cry because they're finally seeing the actual car from their childhood. The lesson here is simple. Hollywood threw away more movie history than they ever saved. And what survived only made it because random people got lucky. The General Lee jump car 1969 Dodge Charger. Warner Brothers destroyed somewhere between 250 and 320 Dodge Chargers, making the Dukes of Hazzard TV series, and they kept terrible records about which cars did what stunts. One of the primary jump cars from the first season ended up in a Georgia junkyard after filming, where it sat rusting for 25 years until a Dukes fan recognized it from specific body damage visible in old episodes. The car was so destroyed that only the VIN tag and some frame rails were salvageable. But the new owner spent $150,000 rebuilding it using period-correct parts and original blueprints from the show. What makes this car special is the documentation proving it performed the iconic barn jump from Season 1, which fans consider the most important stunt in the entire series. The problem with General Lee cars is that hundreds of tribute cars exist, but actual screen-used Chargers are almost impossible to authenticate because Warner Brothers didn't track them. This particular car showed up at the Valolo Auto Museum in Illinois, where it became one of their biggest attractions because people finally got to see a real hero car instead of another tribute build. The tragic part of the General Lee story is how many pristine 1969 Chargers got sacrificed for a TV show that could have used fiberglass replicas for half the stunts. Today, original screen used General Lee's command six-figure prices when they surface with proper documentation because collectors understand how few actually survived the jumps, crashes, and studio liquidation sales that followed cancellation. The Blues Mobile 1974 Dodge Monaco. The 1980 Blues Brothers movie used 13 police spec Dodge Monos for various scenes. And after filming Wrapped in Chicago, most got auctioned off or scrapped. The primary hero car that Jake and Elwood actually drove disappeared for nearly 30 years until a California collector found it in a police impound auction. Still painted black and white but missing the roof-mounted speaker. The car had been used as an actual police cruiser in Illinois after filming, which explains why it accumulated over 200,000 meters and needed a complete rebuild when the collector authenticated it through production notes. What saved this car was a unique VIN number that appeared in Universal Studios records and matched specific camera angles from the famous chase scenes through downtown Chicago. The collector spent 3 years restoring it to screen-accurate condition, including tracking down the correct Motorola radio equipment and even the right brand of cigarette lighter. The car now appears at movie car shows and blues festivals where fans line up to take pictures inside the same vehicle that jumped bridges and crashed through shopping malls on screen. The interesting detail is how Universal kept such terrible records that nobody even knew this car still existed until production. Paperwork surfaced during a studio archive cleaning. These monos were considered worthless junk in the 1980s, which is why so many got destroyed or modified beyond recognition before anyone thought to preserve them. If this car hadn't ended up in that specific police auction, it would have been crushed decades ago. And nobody would have known the difference. Before we get to number 6, hit that like button if you're enjoying these incredible stories of lost movie history. Drop a comment telling me which movie car you'd love to see get found. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next video. These cars represent the greatest era of practical movie effects. And every survivor is a miracle. The Mad Max Interceptor. 1973 Ford Falcon XB GT, the Black Pursuit Special from the original 1979 Mad Max, became one of the most iconic movie cars ever built. And after filming Wrapped in Australia, it vanished completely for over 20 years. The car ended up in a California junkyard with the blower and side pipes removed, painted primer gray, and sitting on blocks with a seized engine. A Mad Max fan recognized it from specific body modifications visible in the original film, including custom fender flares and a unique roll cage that appeared in crash scenes. He bought the wreck for $5,000 in 2011 and spent the next decade authenticating it through Australian Film Commission records and interviews with the original builder. The restoration cost over $250,000 because every custom part had to be recreated by hand, including the famous weigh-in 671 supercharger and side exhaust system that defined the car's look. What makes this discovery remarkable is how close the car came to being crushed for scrap metal because the junkyard owner had no idea what he was sitting on. The car now lives in a climate-controlled garage and gets shown at major automotive events where fans treat it like religious artifact from the golden age of practical movie effects. The problem with tracking down movie cars is that studios rarely kept records about what happened after production wrapped, especially for low-budget Australian films that nobody expected would become cultural touchstone. This Interceptor survived purely through luck and the obsession of one fan who refused to believe the car was gone forever, even when everyone told him he was chasing a ghost. Eleanor, 1971 Plymouth Barracuda from Gone in 60 Seconds. The original 1974 Gone in 60 Seconds movie used a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda for the famous Ella Laner chase scene. And after filming Wrapped, the car disappeared into storage for over 15 years. A movie car collector tracked it down in a Long Beach warehouse in 1989, buried under film equipment and missing most of its custom parts. The car had been painted back to standard yellow from the movie's custom silver, and the 446-pack engine had been swapped for a regular 383 by someone who didn't know what they were destroying. What saved this car was the VIN number, matching production notes from director H.B. Helicky's personal records, plus unique chassis modifications made specifically for the jump scenes. The new owner spent years hunting down period-correct parts to restore it to screen-accurate condition, including tracking down the actual fabricator who built the custom bumpers and side exhausts. This CUDA now lives in a private collection and rarely gets shown because the owner learned that every time it appears in public, someone tries to buy it for increasingly insane amounts of money. The confusion around Eleanor is that most people remember the 1967 Shelby GT500 from the 2000 remake, not the original Barracuda that started the legend. This makes the original Eleanor even more special because it represents forgotten movie history that predates the modern car culture we know today. The fact that this car survived at all is remarkable, because H.B. Helike destroyed over 90 cars making the original film, and most of the hero vehicles got scrapped after filming, because nobody thought to preserve them. Smokey and the Bandit Trans Am, 1977 Pontiac Firebird. Universal used 4 identical black and gold Trans Ams for the 1977 Smokey and the Bandit movie, and after filming wrapped, 3 got destroyed during production or sold off as regular used cars. The primary hero car that Burt Reynolds actually drove disappeared for 35 years, until a collector found it in a New Jersey storage facility. Still wearing its movie paint but missing the T-tops and most of the interior. The owner had no idea what he had because the car had been repainted partially and sat unused since 1984 when he bought it at an estate sale. Authentication came through production notes that showed this specific Trans Am had unique engine modifications and a reinforced chassis for stunt work that didn't appear on regular production Firebirds. The collector who found it spent $90,000 restoring it to screen-accurate condition, including sourcing the correct Hurst hatch T-tops and the specific CB radio equipment Burt Reynolds used in the film. This car now shows up at major automotive events where middle-aged fans line up for hours to sit behind the wheel and relive their teenage dreams about running Sheriff Buford T. Justice. The wild part is how many tribute Trans Ams exist compared to actual screen-used cars, because every black and gold Firebird with a chicken decal gets called the Bandit car at cruise nights across America. This particular Trans Am survived because someone stored it properly and got lucky, not because Universal made any effort to preserve it after production wrapped. If you grew up in the 70s, this car represents everything cool about that era. And seeing the real hero vehicle is like touching a piece of your own childhood that you thought was gone forever. The Ghostbusters Ecto-1 1959 Cadillac Miller Meteor. Columbia Pictures used one 1959 Cadillac Professional Chassis Ambulance for the 1984 Ghostbusters movie, and after filming wrapped, it disappeared into storage at Sony Studios. The car sat neglected for 20 years, accumulating dust and deteriorating until a studio tour guide noticed it buried under tarps in a corner warehouse. By the time Sony authenticated it in 2010, the Ecto-1 was in terrible shape with rusted floor pans, a seized engine, and most of its custom ghost hunting equipment missing or damaged. Sony partnered with a professional restoration shop to rebuild it for the 30th anniversary celebration, spending over $200,000 returning it to screen-accurate condition. The restoration team had to recreate all the custom rooftop equipment, including the siren, lights, and ghost detection gear, using original production photos and blueprints from the special effects department. This Ecto-1 now tours the country, appearing at movie events and conventions where fans treat it like a returning hero from their childhood. The interesting detail is that Sony had no idea where this car was for most of 2 decades because studio warehouses are so massive that vehicles literally get lost behind other props and equipment. What saved the Ecto-1 was timing, because if that tour guide had walked past it 5 years later, the car probably would have been scrapped during a warehouse cleaning. The car has become more famous now than it was during the original movie run because social media and convention culture keep it in constant demand for appearances and photo opportunities. The Batmobile 1966 Lincoln Futura concept. George Barrers built the iconic 1966 Batmobile from a 1955 Lincoln Futura concept car that Ford had sitting in storage. And after the TV series ended in 1968, the car spent decades touring car shows and promotional events. What most people don't know is that the original Hero Batmobile disappeared from public view in the 1980s and sat in Barrys's personal warehouse for nearly 15 years. During that time, Barrys built several replicas that toured while the real Hero car deteriorated in storage, creating confusion about which Batmobile was actually the screen-used original. The Hero car resurfaced in the 1990s when Barrys finally brought it to a major car show, and automotive historians authenticated it through unique chassis modifications and details that appeared in original production photos. Barrys eventually sold the Hero Batmobile at Barrett-Jackson in 2013 for $4.62 million, making it one of the most valuable movie cars ever sold at public auction. The buyer was a lifelong Batman fan who wanted to preserve it properly because even in Barese's care, the car had suffered from years of hard use at promotional events and inadequate storage. This Batmobile represents the peak of custom car culture and practical TV effects because everything you saw on screen was real fabrication work, not CGI or green screen trickery. The confusion around the Batmobile's history shows how even famous movie cars can get lost in their own legend, especially when replicas outnumber originals and documentation gets scattered across decades. Today, the hero Batmobile lives in a climate-controlled facility and only appears at major automotive events where 3 generations of Batman fans line up to see the car that defined the James Bond's Aston Martin DB5 Goldfinger Sock Thunderball. Aston Martin built 2 DB5 South for the 1964 Goldfinger movie. And after filming Wrapped, one got used for promotional tours, while the other stayed with Eon Productions for the 1965 Thunderball sequel. The touring car disappeared in 1997 when it was stolen from a Florida airport hangar, and despite a $25,000 reward, it remained missing for over 20 years. The FBI believes the car was immediately shipped overseas and hidden in a private collection because something that famous and valuable couldn't be sold publicly without triggering every law enforcement database in the world. What makes this story fascinating is that the other DB5, the actual screenless-used hero car from both films, spent 40 years in private ownership after Eon sold it in 1969 for just $12,000. A collector bought it in 2010 at RM Southern for $4.6 million, making it the most expensive DB5 ever sold and one of the most valuable movie cars in existence. This DB5 still has all its original gadgets, including the working smokescreen, oil slick sprayer, and bulletproof shield, because the special effects team built real functional equipment instead of props. The car now appears at major automotive events under heavy security where James Bond fans treat it like the automotive equivalent of the Holy Grail. The stolen DB5 remains missing to this day, which means somewhere in the world, someone is sitting on the most famous movie car in history and can never admit they own it. The fact that Eon Productions sold these cars in the first place shows how little Hollywood valued movie history in the 1960s and 70s because nobody imagined James Bond would still be a cultural phenomenon 60 years later. If that stolen DB5 ever surfaces, it'll be worth $20 million or more, assuming the thief can figure out how to sell the most recognizable stolen property on the planet. There you have it, folks. 10 famous movie cars that disappeared after filming and somehow survived to tell the tale. From junkyards to barns to studio warehouses, these cars prove that movie history is fragile and preservation is everything. Hit that subscribe button so you catch our next video, and thanks for watching. Remember, the best movie cars are the ones that made it home.